Ok. ¿Ya estamos, profesor Ortega?
Sí, adelante.
Good evening, everybody, here to the Katz Center, to our last session of this quarter devoted to the idea of Mexico in the world and the war in Mexico. And we thought it was not going to be complete if we didn't deal with the complicated situation of diplomacy in Mexico or the problems that Mexico is currently facing in his foreign policy, especially today, as you know, the news of the American citizen kidnapped and killed in Matamoros. And we try and try a lot to invite Ambassador Arturo Sarukhán, because he's by far the person who has often talked to us and enlightened us about the situation of Mexican foreign policy and Mexico in the world of diplomacy and strategy. Ambassador Sarukhán, as many of you know, is an international strategy consultant now. He was the ambassador of Mexico in the US and has been dealing with Mexican foreign policy for many, many years. Is now an international consultant, has been a visiting professor in many universities, is one of the most important authorities on Mexican foreign policy and international situation. And I'm very, very, very happy and thankful for him to accept to talk to us here in the Katz Center on behalf of Professor Emilio Curi, who is the director of the center. I thank him enormously for accepting to speak to us today. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mauricio. Good afternoon to everyone. It's always a distinct pleasure to join the Katz Center at the University of Chicago. This is undoubtedly a favorite place of mine because of the role that Friedrich Katz played in another institution that I have deep roots in, the Colegio de Mexico, and Friedrich Katz's work and publications there. So it's always good, even if it's now virtual, to be back at the Katz Center and at the University of Chicago, and to engage with many of you on the important issues at stake in what is undoubtedly one of the most fundamental foreign policy agenda items that the United States has on its radar screen. Obviously, when you look at the US's foreign policy and national security footprint these days, it's for reasons that are unsurprising, focused on the unfortunate events in Eastern Europe, on growing tensions and potential geopolitical dislocation with China, and what is probably the most important recalibration of US foreign policy since the end of the Cold War, which is the relationship with Beijing, both geostrategically, but also in terms of the trade, economic, and digital agendas. It's obviously focused on the concerning developments in the Middle East with a new Israeli government and some of the challenges and dynamics that are being triggered as a result of the most far right-leaning government that Israel has had in its history. So many would say, well, Mexico, yeah, it's important, but is it really that fundamental to the foreign policy footprint of the United States? I obviously would argue that Mexico is one of those keystone diplomatic relationships for the United States. It is a fundamental nation that impacts the daily well-being, prosperity, security of Americans and of Mexicans alike. This is a two-way street, as always. And again, unfortunately, the horrendous and tragic events that have played out in Moros and Tamaulipas since Friday, and which today have culminated in the deaths of 2 US citizens and the release of 2 others, I think, again, underscore the challenges of a very complex, a very asymmetrical diplomatic relationship that exists between these two countries. But as most things in life, you start at the beginning, and let me start at the beginning with sort of my take on the general outlook of Mexican foreign policy these days. You're not going to be surprised to hear me say that I'm concerned on a number of fronts. Yes, the government of President López Obrador, with his mantra that the best foreign policy is domestic policy, isn't that too dissimilar to other governments of the left, of the right, that have come out with a default position linking foreign policy to domestic policy. You see it today in the United States with the Biden administration, the foreign policy for middle class. You saw it with Obama. You've seen it in a lot of European nations, where I think governments battle with the imperative of linking a country's foreign diplomatic footprint with how that impacts and moves the needle of domestic political and public policies. However, the challenge with López Obrador is that he really is, as I have said recently, in my view, the most uninterested intellectually president when it comes to the world surrounding Mexico. Peña Nieto was bad, but López Obrador is even worse. Obviously, he has very little interest, very little appetite in engaging with the international community. The fact that he is the president of one of the G20 countries, and during his 4 years and change in office, has never, ever been present at one of the G20 summits, has never spoken, not even during Mexico's 2-year tenure as a non-permanent member at the UN Security Council, that he never has taken to the stage at the UN to address the UN General Assembly. You know, you're talking about the 13th largest economy in the world, one of the two important political diplomatic powerhouses in the hemisphere. He really doesn't have time. He doesn't have the patience. He doesn't have the appetite. He doesn't have the bandwidth for foreign policy. And again, maybe if we were Croatia, and I don't want to insult our Croatian friends, but you know, maybe you can understand why a country and a prime minister of Croatia would dedicate so much of his or her time to addressing domestic political issues. But again, we're talking about Mexico. We're talking about one of the two trading partners of the United States, a country that has 3,000-kilometer border with one of the most important powers, global powers on the face of the earth. And if this were just it, then you'd say, okay, you know, it's fine. Some presidents can spend time and bandwidth addressing domestic political affairs. But the problem is that along with his disinterest, you've seen a host of policy decisions which have made this analysis, which make this analysis even more concerning, starting with the fact that as a candidate on the campaign trail, President López Obrador railed against previous governments of the PRI and the PAN, arguing that they had used the Mexican Foreign Service, the diplomatic service, as a tool to garner political favors by designating political appointees in plum choice positions abroad in embassies and missions and consulates. This is nothing new. Previous Mexican governments have always used political appointments. I don't have to tell you how that system works in the US, where sometimes it's not even political appointments, it's simply people who fundraise during presidential campaign. So it's not Mexico has not traditionally been an outlier in the fact that it appoints political appointees to some key positions abroad. But López Obrador during his campaign argued precisely against this, said he wouldn't do it. And if you look at the numbers today, no previous government in Mexico's recent history has made the amount of political appointments that this president has made in Mexican embassies, consulates, and missions abroad. There is an important evisceration, bureaucratic evisceration the foreign policy bandwidth of Mexico by having scuppered ProMéxico, Mexico's trade investment authority, by having shuttered Mexico's tourism and promotion authority. Now, because of his belief in austerity, the most recent decision, which is that, imagine if you think of some of the trade issues that Mexico and the United States are facing today, the fact that as of a month ago, we no longer have an attaché from the Ministry of Economy in Mexico at our embassies at our mission in Geneva or our embassy in Washington, D.C. So it's not only the number of political appointees in the Mexican Foreign Service, it's the complete gutting, evisceration of the budget to conduct foreign policy. Many people compare Brazil and Mexico as two of the political diplomatic behemoths in the region, whereas Brazil has opened over the past 2 decades an embassy almost in every single country. Brazil, Mexico can barely garner a handful of embassies in that continent. There is a serious lack of investment in the bureaucratic state capabilities that Mexico requires to conduct its diplomatic agenda. On top of this, the president believes in a Westphalian view of international relations, a view that harks back to the 1970s when he cut his teeth as a PRI politician, where non-intervention, where the Doctrina Estrada, which is consistently confused as non-intervention, has nothing to do with non-intervention. It has to do with the recognition or not of a government. Where this policy is used basically as an excuse to turn a blind eye on countries where there's been serious democratic erosion and human rights violations, but at the same time, where like in Peru today, the president has triggered the declaration of Mexican ambassador as a persona non grata. We had never had a government in Mexican history where 2 Mexican ambassadors had been declared persona non gratas. The first one took place in Bolivia 2 years ago, and the latest has happened in Peru because of the way President López Obrador has positioned himself publicly on the attempted coup that took place with former President Castillo and the unfortunate events that have followed in the aftermath of the constitutional crisis in which Peru is enmeshed in. The president has picked a fight with Spain, has picked a fight with Panama, his position on the Ukraine, where he openly said, asked about he would damn Putin for his war of unjustified aggression against Ukraine. He said, quote unquote, Biden is my partner, but Putin is my friend. The president's pro-Russian neutrality is of profound concern, particularly given the fact that Mexico is a country that has suffered invasion, that has suffered foreign intervention, that has used the Charter of the UN as a North Star for its foreign policy, that Mexico today is in this contradictory position where on the one hand, our mission at the UN condemns, votes in favor of resolutions condemning Russian actions in the Ukraine, but the president continues with his false equivalence of equating Ukraine's right under the Charter of the UN, under Article 51, self-defense, collective defense, to defend itself against Russian aggression, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So the general context of the relationship of Mexico's foreign policy today under López Obrador is not encouraging. I am concerned as to the credibility, the heft, the weight of Mexican foreign policy abroad. But all of this boils down when you look at the most important relationship that Mexico has on the face of the earth, which is the relationship with the United States and in more general terms with its 2 North American partners, Canada and the United States. What you see here is sort of like a Dickensian tale of 2 cities. It's the best of times, it's the worst of times. It's the best of times because precisely because of this recalibration that is taking place in Washington, which is one of the few bipartisan issues in which Republicans and Democrats agree on. I may disagree with how they are reading the current relationship with China, but if there's one thing uniting Democrats and Republicans today in Washington, D.C., it's that the status quo ante of the relationship with China, both on the trade front, on the economic front, and on the geopolitical, national security, national defense front, is untenable. And in light of this, there's a unique opportunity because of reshoring, nearshoring, ally shoring, whatever your favorite term is, because of the relocation of investment, because of the concern of heightened tensions between China and the United States, that there is a unique opportunity, particularly in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, of deepening supply chains in North America. One of the most important success stories of NAFTA and now USMCA, which is the deepening of those essential and strategic supply chains within the North American region. It all boils down to, when I talk about joint supply chains and production platforms in North America, it boils down to a very simple fact. Out of every dollar of Canadian exports to the United States, 28 cents are of US inputs. Out of every dollar of Mexican exports to the United States, 40 cents are of US inputs. We no longer produce Canadian, US, or Mexican goods. We produce North American goods. The COVID pandemic, when Ottawa, Washington, and Mexico City went about defining essential strategic sectors and not understanding that if we didn't align those sectors, we would further deepen supply chain disruption. I think in the context of what is happening in the relationship with China, have finally, and you saw a bit of this in the latest North American summit held in Mexico City at the beginning of this year, a greater understanding that if the United States' recalibration with China is going to succeed, particularly on the trade and economic front and on the trend of the industrial base in North America, from manufacturing to a digital economy, Canada and Mexico need to be centerpieces of the strategy to deepen these supply chains, to attract nearshoring, to deal with issues like critical minerals, to learn the lessons of what the pandemic has taught us in terms of Teflon coating essential national security supply chains. And I think this is one of the few issues where President López Obrador fully understands. It's surprising, but one of the issues that I think that he instinctively does get is the importance of a greater alignment between Mexico, the United States, and Canada vis-a-vis China regarding these issues. The problem then boils down to a reality check. And that reality check starts hitting a brick wall with Mexico's current energy policy paradigm. Because if all of this vision for a more competitive, more integrated North American, the global economy is to come to pass, energy policy, energy independence, energy security, energy resilience, energy sustainability, energy security, this has to be a core component. If current Mexican energy policy paradigms continue to be the same, a lot of what Mexico is trying to attract, and which Tesla and the Tesla investment has refocused attention on, a lot of that will go, as we are seeing, to not Mexico, but to Taiwan and Malaysia and Vietnam and India, which so far are reaping the greatest benefits of the exodus of US and multinational investments in China because of fears of a deep and heightened diplomatic crisis between both countries. And so the fact that today you have two nations that are in general terms aligned on energy policy paradigms, on the green economy, on emissions, on the important role of renewables, Canada and the United States, and you have one country which isn't, Mexico, which paradoxically is a change of what used to happen before when Obama was president, because at that time, it was actually Canada. Canada was the odd man out. It was Prime Minister Harper who didn't believe in this, and it was Mexico and the United States that were aligned on the COP conferences, on emissions, on climate change goals, on the role of renewables. Now it's Mexico. And unless we can ensure that Mexico is much more aligned to its two North American partners on energy policy issues, this opportunity, these strategic opportunities which hit our country, Mexico, certainly in North America, maybe once every generation, this opportunity of really taking advantage of this important dislocation that is happening in trade flows, economic ties between the United States and China, that opportunity will, at the end of the day, despite the Teslas of the world, and despite the fact that some of that nearshoring is actually coming into Mexico because of the role of the USMCA, because of the role of integrated infrastructure between northern Mexico and southern part of the United States, that investment will go elsewhere. And that is a very important reality check that needs to play a role. The other one, which is playing out in front of our eyes today, unfortunately, is the issue of public security. Growing pressure, for those of you here in the US, I don't have to tell you how fentanyl and the fentanyl epidemic has played out in counties and states across the United States. I don't have to tell you the way the Republican Party in particular is pimping this issue, particularly when it comes to border security with Mexico. But the growing pressure from the US Congress, from the administration on fentanyl trafficking from the United States, the growing drumbeat of voices who again suggest that the way to deal with this is by designating Mexican criminal organizations as foreign terrorist organizations, which is the wrong tool and it's a mistaken policy. And we can go into that if you want during the Q&A session. The fact that now with the abduction and the murder of 2 of the 4 US kidnapped citizens that crossed into Matamoros last week, this drumbeat and the way that the GOP will use it to not only sort of portray the Biden administration as weak regarding border security with Mexico, but how the Republican Party will continue to use Mexico as the argument for a national security threat to the United States going into 2024, when 5 or 6 or how many Republican hopefuls run for the nomination of their party, and where each one of them will be trying to out-Trump Trump in terms of how hardline they are on policy issues regarding immigration and border security, and transnational criminal organizations who operate on both sides of the US-Mexico border. This issue will become increasingly complex as both countries, Mexico and the United States, move into what happens every 12 years, which is our 2 presidential electoral cycles coincide. It's not a good thing when you've got this type of drumbeat, when you've got a nationalist president in Mexico who tends to lash out at members of Congress, to incur ad hominem attacks against members of Congress, who attacks the Secretary of State of the United States, suggesting that the Secretary of State isn't towing the line of what Biden's vision in the relationship with Mexico is. When you've got this complex scenario, as both countries move into presidential elections in 2024, you could have a very complex dynamic at play. The wheels, now don't mistake what I'm saying, I'm not suggesting that the wheels in this relationship are going to fall off. There's too much at stake for that to happen. The imperative for the Biden administration of ensuring Mexican collaboration on migration policy on its border will continue to, I think, put the administration in a delicate position between putting pressure on Mexico on a number of fronts and ensuring that it doesn't, pardon my French, piss off the Mexican president and jeopardize Mexico's decision to support the United States in outsourcing U.S. immigration policy and gutting Mexico's migration policy paradigm by simply becoming a second wall of enforcement in migration policy. But it will be a very complex moment. And if on top of this you add the troika of trade disputes that are ongoing right now in the relationship, first of all, the dispute which Mexico and Canada won against the United States on rules of origin for the automotive and auto parts sector, where despite that the 45 days have already expired for the administration to announce whether it's going to comply or not with the ruling of the panel. You've got that issue. You've got the ongoing consultations on Mexican energy policy, which were triggered by Canada and the United States against Mexico. And as of yesterday, we have a second consultation process that has been initiated by the United States on Mexico's biotech and ag import policies particularly regarding yellow GMO corn from the United States into Mexico. And this week, we will likely have a further new dispute under USMCA, this one under the environmental chapter of USMCA, where the US will request consultations with Mexico and a potential dispute panel because of the potential extinction of the vaquita marina in the upper Gulf of Cortez, and where you also have the likely ban on shrimp exports, again, from Mexico to the United States because of bycatch of sea turtles, particularly in the Mexican Pacific. So what you have is a very convoluted bilateral agenda, a very important opportunity when you look at the strategic drivers that could turn the 21st century into truly North American century of opportunity, of a deepening of the framework and the architecture of North American collaboration. I must say that despite the swipes that I have taken at President López Obrador's foreign policy, I was very encouraged to see in the day before the North American summit a trilateral statement by the three leaders on support for democracy in Brazil after the attempted replication of Trump's coup d'etat in Washington by followers of Bolsonaro in Brazil. I think that is the way to go. I think Mexico, Canada, and the United States should be talking not only about democracy in Brazil, of a country that López Obrador feels is ideologically aligned to his, even though I don't think López Obrador is a leftist, but that's another story. I wish that statement regarding Brazil were also issued regarding Cuba and Venezuela and the profound, troubling democratic crumbling and erosion that we're seeing in Nicaragua. But certainly what we have, I think, particularly when you look at North America at this moment in time, is a mixed bag. I think there's a huge strategic promise ahead of us. I think there are real significant opportunities, but I think that the reality check of how foreign policy plays a role in López Obrador's vision, his lack of understanding of how the United States operates politically, his, I think, increasing temptation as we head into Mexican political electoral dynamics into 2024. I think his growing predisposition to take swipes at the United States, to continue to poke his finger in the eye of the United States, of President Biden, as he has done both in the Oval Office during his bilateral visit to Washington and during the trilateral press conference in the Summit of the Americas, where he basically kidnapped the press conference by going on a rant for 25 minutes, answering a question and hogging the bandwidth that the three leaders had to answer questions from the press. These dynamics will remain a salient issue of how Mexico engages, first of all, in this critically important relationship with its two most important partners, Canada and the United States, in the North American context. And in the North American context, when it comes to China, but also in larger terms, Mexico's foreign policy footprint, foreign policy appetite, foreign policy bandwidth, which again, for someone who is a recovering diplomat who spent 23 years in the Mexican Foreign Service as a career diplomat, is truly troubling and disconcerting. And I'll stop here and address some of your questions in the minutes that we have ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Sarukhán. It was a very enlightening and worrisome panorama. But of course, I have a question, but I will receive the questions from the audience. Please use the little hand in the Zoom so that I know you want to ask a question. Patrick, how are you, Patrick?
I'm well, Mauricio. How are you? It's nice to see you.
And Mauricio, can I simply, because I just see names, but I mostly don't see faces. Can people just give me a sense of Patrick? I know you, but can people just sort of give me a sense
Patrick,
of who they are and where they come from?
Yes, please tell your name and something about you. But Patrick, of course, needs no introduction.
I doubt that very much.
Patrick the Great.
Mauricio, you're too kind. My name is Patrick Iber. I teach Latin American history at the University of Wisconsin, and I'm proud to have been a student of Mauricio's at the University of Chicago. I have a very specific question, Ambassador, and it relates to one of your successors. I don't know if you've been following the back and forth between Ambassador Barcena and but I'd be curious to hear you comment on that conflict and your reading of what it means for Minister Ebrard's hopes to be the candidate of Morena in the 2024 elections.
I'll be relatively kosher because I do think that even though we are no longer in functions, which is the case of the former ambassador and my several times removed successor, we are bound by certain rules as to how we talk about what we did and what we didn't do as ambassadors per Mexico's Foreign Service internal laws. First of all, let me start with the last part of your question, and I'll probably be relatively kosher in my response, Patrick. But first of all, I don't think it'll hurt Foreign Secretary Ebrard immensely, because foreign policy is really not an issue in how candidates are perceived and how the impact that foreign policy generally has in Mexican presidential elections. The fact that this is also, and this I do say sadly and tragically, the fact that this is also about migration policy, which is a huge contradiction for a country that has 5 million undocumented Mexicans living in the United States and a Mexican-American diaspora in the United States of 35 million living here. The great tragedy and contradiction is that Mexico, being a country of emigration, really doesn't give a shit about migration policy, Mexican migrants in the United States. And it's a very sad fact, and it's a very sad reality. So the double combination of its migration issues and migration policy, and the fact that in general terms, foreign policy doesn't really matter domestically in Mexico. The fact that López Obrador waxed lyrical and sucked up to Trump, a guy who constantly attacked Mexico and had absolutely no impact in terms of López Obrador's popularity or approval ratings, tells you a bit of how foreign policy issues play out in Mexico. So I don't think it's gonna, those who are vying for the Morena candidacy have been sort of regurgitating this and sort of trying to get exposure on this issue domestically in the press in Mexico. But at the end of the day, Patrick, I don't think it's an issue that's going to move the needle on whether Marcelo Ebrard becomes or doesn't become a candidate and succeeds or not as a candidate. I think it is absolutely irrelevant. Look, relations between Mexican ambassadors and Mexican foreign secretaries has never been good. Historically, I can go down the list of Mexican ambassadors that had testy relationships with their bosses at the foreign ministry. Some were better, some were worse, but I don't think there's ever been a peachy and rosy relationship with a Mexican ambassador in Washington and the foreign minister in turn. And the relationship between Ebrard and the first ambassador of the López Obrador administration was never good. It was never good from the get-go, and it only became more and more and more poisonous as her tenure advanced. And I may agree or disagree with what each one of them has said about what they did and what they didn't do, but I frankly really don't care about what at the end is what I have said always from day one, which is I think López Obrador made a mistake in kowtowing, in bending the knee to Trump in March of 2019, when the threat of punitive tariffs on Mexican exports was used to force Mexico into basically accepting remain in Mexico and a safe third country de facto paradigm, which is, I think, what really should matter.
Thank you for your answer.
René.
Thank you, Mauricio. My name is René Flores. I'm a sociologist here at the University of Chicago. Thank you, Ambassador, for your thoughts. I wanted to pick your brain on the public security issue a little bit more. I wanted to get your reaction, particularly to the events of the last few days. Genaro Garcia, the Genaro Garcia head of security of Calderon, but more generally, how can Mexico move forward with public security, and what role does the U.S. can play in this moving forward of Mexico?
Yeah, look, the trial and the verdict against Genaro Garcia Luna, I think, is an indictment on several fronts. It is an indictment on the way Mexico and the United States have been fighting international narcotics and transnational criminal organizations for a long time. I think the paradigm is completely broken. That's why I'm concerned that as things have soured and become even more attractive for red meat politics and whistle dog politics in the United States on this issue, that what you're starting to see again is this whole debate on, oh, we should, use the military, we should use the armed forces, the US military, as a tool against transnational criminal organizations in Mexico, or we should designate these organizations as foreign terrorist organizations, FTOs. Those of us who've been in government or who are, I still see someone on the call who's in government, my dear friend and a great Mexican consul in Chicago. For those of us who've been in government or are in government, we love acronyms. FTOs is foreign terrorist organizations, which is the formal designation that the State Department can use to designate actors or groups operating abroad as terrorists. I think it also underscores some important questions that need to be asked of US agencies that during both the Fox and the Calderon administrations worked hand in hand with the former public security the individuals who engaged with him, who vetted him, who were exchanging intelligence and information. And I think some serious questions need to be asked as to what are the paradigms, what are the processes, what are the criteria, what are the protocols, and what are the moral compasses that both countries, both governments have used in the fight against organized crime. I believe that the paradigm is broken. It's been broken for a long time. I'm concerned that something that started with the Fox administration and then has been replicated throughout the Calderón, the Peña Nieto, and now the López Obrador administration, which is the so-called kingpin paradigm, which is, or the kingpin strategy, which is the idea that was foisted on Mexico and on other countries with which the US government was collaborating on narcotics policy at the time, of the idea that you decapitate, you arrest the top leadership of criminal organizations, and that will degrade their ability to conduct their illicit business. The fact that despite the hugs for the hugs, not bullets, I call it hugs for thugs, but the fact that the hugs for bullets paradigm sort of suggests that the Mexican administration had understood that that paradigm was broken. The fact that the rearrest of Ovidio Guzman is an additional proof that we continue on both sides of the US-Mexico border to use the kingpin paradigm, the kingpin strategy, as the main grade to confront criminal organizations. I think the pyramid of instruments that we use in the fight against organized crime has to be completely turned on its head. I think harm eradication and harm mitigation policies need to be at the top of that pyramid. I think that money laundering has to be at the top of that pyramid. The United States, René, learned a very important lesson in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks of 9/11, which was that regardless of how many special units you put in Tora Bora or in Pakistan or in Iraq, at the end of the day, it was going to be geeks with computers sitting at the Department of the Treasury in Washington, D.C., by bringing in an interagency process of tracking the money, denying the money to these international terrorist organizations, that has really, in many ways, been the responsible factor for today not having seen a terrorist attack on US homeland since 9/11. And that paradigm of degrading the money laundering ability of transnational criminal organizations should be at the top of the pyramid. The problem is that most agencies that fight organized crime love shiny toys. They love helicopters and they love drones and they love go fast boats, because by including these items in congressional budgets, this is what they like. This is what the policy and the paradigms of interdiction and eradication are driven on. I'm not an economist, but you don't need to be a Nobel laureate to figure out that if you've got a completely inelastic supply, a completely inelastic demand for drugs and a completely elastic supply of drugs, the only thing that you do by putting pressure on production and transshipment is to create more and more and more incentives for people to come into that piece of the equation where the real money is made, which is in the transshipment and transit of illicit drugs into consumer markets. So that plus the fact that I think that despite the fact that many people may squirm at this, I think governments, there's this parable in China of the nail that sticks out the furthest, and that the idea is that of all the nails on a piece of wood, you hit the one with the head sticking out the furthest. This idea of you publicly state that you're going to go after the more violent, the more pernicious criminal organizations. The idea being that by using all the resources of the state to confront the more violent groups operating in a country, that by degrading their ability, A, you bring down levels of violence by going after the more violent groups, and B, that you create sort of a show and tell effect, which is that other criminal organizations, because of the overpowering assets of the state used to target one specific criminal organization, which you publish. It's not a hidden agenda. It's not you're favoring one group over the other. You publicly come out and say, we're going to go out after Jalisco Nueva Generación because they are the most violent. They're the group that has extended its tentacles in Mexico. They're the ones creating greater violence with other rival groups. We, the Mexican state, are going to go after Jalisco Nueva Generación with everything that we've got. And yes, that means that we're going to ignore the other guys for the time being. We're going to go after the more violent group. And that part of that at the end of the day, if you succeed, will or should diminish the levels of violence being unleashed by other criminal groups that operate in the ecosystem. So some of this, obviously, policies related to rehabilitation, treatment have to be at the top of that pyramid. Declaring criminal organizations as foreign terrorist organizations so that you can argue you can send a SEAL team into Matamoros is not the way to go, and it will only create the perverse incentives for a paradigm that has been broken for a very long time.
Thank you, Susan.
Good afternoon, Ambassador Sarukhán. Thank you so much for an incredibly illuminating talk. I have been teaching full-time at the University of Chicago for the last 20 years and was director of the university's Human Rights Center. But more importantly, I'm a member of a law firm that in the last couple of decades has done a lot of litigation on behalf of Mexicans in the United States, including the litigation against Western Union on behalf of former braceros, and a project for the Relaciones Exteriores, where we were representing Mexican workers against abusive employers in the US. My question may push you more into Mexican domestic policy than you'd like to be, but this is a fascinating panorama. And so I think a question occurring to all of us is, what change might we see in Mexico after the 2024 elections? Who do you see as the likely candidates, or which party is likely to be successful, and how might that change the picture that you have just painted for us? Thank you very much.
That's the crystal ball, or in my case, given that I'm a Lord of the Ring fans, that's the Palantir question of choice in Mexico today. If the election were held today, as things stand today, there's no doubt in my mind that Morena sweeps the election, regardless of who the candidate is, the mayor of Mexico City, the current foreign secretary, or the current interior minister, regardless of who the candidate is. The big question, I think, Susan, lies in whether the opposition will get its act together or not. Many people sort of, particularly in the last week, have sort of suggested, because of this very important civil society social mobilization that we saw in Mexico a week ago in defense of Mexico's National Electoral Institute and against President López Obrador's so-called Plan B, which I think is a serious threat to Mexico's democratic resilience and strength. Many people have sort of tended to say, because we saw that means the opposition has a greater chance of defeating Morena in 2024. I think they're wrong. I think the key will be basically sort of using a James Carville metaphor, it's the process, stupid. I think that it's not going to depend on who the candidate of the opposition is. It's not going to depend on which parties sort of accompany the opposition alliance. It's going to be in the process. If the political party structures of the parties that today conform the opposition alliance, PRI, PRD, and PAN, if those party hierarchies and structures in closeted, behind closed doors processes choose a candidate, I can tell you right now, the opposition is going to fail. If, on the contrary, the opposition opens up the process to consultation, to bringing in NGOs and civil society, to creating fora where people can talk about their aspirations, what they would like to see an opposition candidate to look like, if they and there they piggyback on what we saw in the streets of Mexico last week, then I think the opposition has a shot. I think it has a shot. I think there are some candidates that are strong. There are some Morena candidates that I think are better candidates or more accomplished candidates than others. I certainly would see if sort of, again, playing with scenarios, if the opposition were wise enough, intelligent enough, responsible enough to do what I've just described, and the candidate were Claudia Sheinbaum, I think there's a good shot for the opposition to beat her. I don't think Claudia Sheinbaum is a particularly compelling candidate. She doesn't seem to connect very well with the man or woman on the street, despite being mayor of Mexico City. Remember, part of what's behind I think, in my view, personal view, behind López Obrador's plan B regarding the National Electoral Institute is, remember what happened. This is something that a lot of people are missing. One of the most important results of Mexico's midterms in 2021 was that Morena lost 8 of the 10 largest metropolitan areas in Mexico, and that they lost most of the boroughs in Mexico City, which had been a PRD Morena bastion. So Morena today has a relevant, serious, I think, problem with middle-class, urban, metropolitan voters. And if they can't find a way to sort of bring them back into the fold in the way that López Obrador successfully did in 2018, then with the scenario that I described for you, the opposition doing the right thing, and Claudia Sheinbaum, whom I think is the second weakest candidate, I think the strongest candidate is Marcelo Ebrard. I think the second strongest is Claudia Sheinbaum, and I think the weakest of the 3 main Morena contenders is the Secretary of the Interior. If Sheinbaum, who is clearly the president's favorite to succeed him as a Morena candidate and a potential Morena president, then the opposition might have a shot.
Thank you, Ambassador. Any other question? Oh, may I ask a question, Ambassador? In your view, not that we know, but in your view, what is Mexico? I mean, regardless of the moral issue of how Mexico is becoming the kind of Turkey for the United States in keeping the immigrants, if we leave aside the moral issues and the human rights issues, what is Mexico getting back for that? I mean, Turkey gets paid a lot of money for that. And why such an irrational policy?
Because Mauricio, it is a transactional policy, but it's not a transactional policy based on the US-Mexico bilateral agenda. It's a transactional policy based on López Obrador's understanding of how foreign policy works. And for López Obrador, the only thing that matters in having bent the knee to Trump and now accepting Biden's request for continued help on the migration front is in his head. If I do this, then I can push back and I can Teflon coat US intervention in what I think are the domestic affairs of Mexico. That's why you see him railing out when a Secretary Blinken or a assistant secretary for the Western Hemisphere or a administrative of USAID come out in defense, very, very careful and very kosher defense of Mexico's National Electoral Institute. That's why you see López Obrador lashing out, because in his view, what he got from his deal with Trump was that Trump, who didn't give a carrot or a radish 2 cents regarding Mexican domestic politics or other issues of bilateral agenda, López Obrador thinks that he can leverage cooperation and support with the Biden administration's immigration policies and can inoculate what he sees as the unwanted, unwarranted in purely domestic Mexican political issues. Remember, this is a guy, as I said, who cut his teeth politically in the 1970s, who is reading the PRI manual of how to manage the relationship with the United States, which was keep the economic and trade relationship close, but keep the political, security, geopolitical relationship at an arm's length. He truly believes that there's absolutely no connection between the domestic policies of either nation and the foreign policy agenda. What I started calling as Mexican ambassador to the United States, piggybacking on Bayless Manning's very famous essay on US foreign policy in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, where he was talking about how increasingly US foreign policy was being dictated by Congress, and therefore he coined this term intermestic, from international and domestic. Well, I sort of borrowed that and said one of the fundamental changes that has occurred in US-Mexico bilateral relations as a result of NAFTA and 9/11 and what followed in the 2-3 decades after NAFTA is that the relationship has become truly intermestic. That is, the domestic politics of either country profoundly impact the bilateral agenda. If you look at all the salient issues that compose the diplomatic bilateral agenda between Mexico and the United States, drugs, border, infrastructure, migration, trade, energy, water, climate change, all these issues are profoundly grounded in the domestic politics of the United States. And to paraphrase Tip O'Neill, who used to say all politics is local, everything in the US-Mexico bilateral agenda is local. It's local politics, it's local public policies. And this is something that López Obrador simply does not understand, and does not understand how this plays out.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador Sarukhán. I think we have exploited you already too much. Thank you very much for all your wonderful talk. It was very illuminating. The Katz Center and Emilio and I thank you personally very much for accepting to.
I always
thank you very much.
I always see the Katz Center as a home away from home in Chicago, so it's always a great pleasure to join you there and to join the Katz and University of Chicago community and the broader community that is linked to the Katz Center in the United States.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you very much. See you. Nos vemos.
I hope to see you in the flesh soon in Chicago.
I hope so. Nos vemos. Adiós.